Welcome to my channel on the Best of Fantasy. Today I am reviewing Mushroom Blues. This is book one of the Hoffman Report by Adrian Gibson, and it also happens to be an SPFBO 10 finalist. If you're not familiar with SPFBO, it is the contest founded by author Mark Lawrence to shine a light on some wonderful self-published fantasy, and this iteration is sometimes referred to as SPFBOX, with the X on the end standing in for the Roman numeral 10. And this is as according to the author himself, Adrian Gibson, a fungal punk noir, which I think is a very fun and accurate description for what we have here. It is a gritty detective mystery crime story with some very original, fantastical elements, such as, well, mushroom people. But the story is also a vehicle for exploring some really big and important themes, such as the effects of colonization on both the colonizers and the colonized. Also, the role of personal trauma in how we perceive others, and the fundamental commonalities that connect people of all sorts, even though many people refuse to acknowledge such commonalities. Now let's talk a little bit about the colonization. The setting for the story is Hoppan, which is very clearly an analog to Japan in many ways, in terms of the language, in terms of the culture, many aspects of the culture being a kind of high context culture with a lot of ritual aspects to it. So it resembles in many ways an East Asian culture. Although the people there are mushroom people, fungals as they're referred to, and there are various unpleasant terms that the human characters use for the natives of Hoppan. Speaking of the human characters, the Coprinians are essentially a stand-in for an exploitative Western power. And so this is very much a situation where you have the native fungals in a situation of oppression relative to the humans, who have conducted a war of conquest, the Spore War, as it's called, a very destructive war of conquest that has left a lot of poverty and despair in its wake. And so you can see that there is a lot of room to explore some very important themes in such a setting. This war has left a lot of destruction, both physical and cultural destruction. We're talking about the dismantling of a culture in many ways as part of the act of conquest, and the poverty and dehumanization that result as well are a very big part of the context here. It is a little bit ironic to see, of course, an occupier using such violence and referring to the native peoples as a barbaric. But nevertheless, this is something we have certainly seen in history, the projection of barbarism onto the conquered. In terms of the characters that find themselves amidst this context, we have the main character, Henrietta Hoffman, who is the eponymous protagonist of the Hoffman Reports, and she is one of the colonizers. She's a human, and she's also deeply racist, or fungalist, or whatever we might call it in this case, but she has imbibed a lot of the hatred toward the fungals that her people exhibit routinely. And it is pretty disturbing. And it is supposed to be. That is really the point, I think, of this character. We are supposed to be disturbed by her racism. And it has many, a lot of it has to do with her own personal history, her own personal trauma. And so there's a lot in here about the ways in which societal prejudice can interact with personal trauma in terms of an individual's hatred toward a certain group of people. And that is, I think, a very fascinating aspect of this. It is also very important that Henrietta is a woman, because she is from a very patriarchal society. And being a woman in a police force, the police force of the occupiers, puts her in an interesting position, because yes, she is an occupier, yes, she is racist and very unpleasant on many occasions, but she's also a woman, and she knows what it is to suffer from being the odd one out, from being the victim of some vicious stereotypes, of prejudiced treatment and whatnot. So it is a situation where there is a way for this character to sympathize with the oppressed people who are all around her. So that is, I think, an important part of who she is. And she ends up working with a native to Hopon named Koji Nameko. And this all takes, by the way, in the city called Neo Kiniko. I think I've got that right, if I'm remembering that right. But anyway, Koji is a native, and this is not a partnership that Henrietta is too keen about to begin with. It is something to see the struggles of Koji, who is really just trying to make life better for his people. And that brings up, I think, some interesting themes as well in terms of how the colonized can try to engage with the colonizer. Do you work within the system in order to improve things, or do you resist? And how do you resist? Through violence, or are there more peaceful means that could be effective? So this is something that is wrestled with to some degree in the story as well. And you have some secondary characters and some nuance there in terms of this dynamic between oppressor and oppressed. But it is really interesting how such oppression twists both the oppressors and the oppressed. So you do see some natives, some fungals who are pretty bad individuals who have suffered from the war and the subsequent poverty and have taken drastic measures that are harmful not only to the colonizers but to their own people. Their response is a kind of survival of the fittest in a situation as grim as this occupied nation is facing. You also have some of the occupiers, some of the colonizers who have aspects of their personalities that suggest that maybe they're redeemable, that they actually aren't entirely horrible, evil, exploitative people. For example, you have Henrietta's immediate supervisor, who's clearly racist, who says some awful things and exploits the natives in some really horrific ways, but at the same time is capable of a little bit of self-awareness and perhaps calling out others whose racism and bigotry is even worse than his own. So there is that. So this is the context here. But I do really appreciate what Adrian Gibson was trying to do with these characters, with Henrietta in particular, because there is, as you would expect with a character of this nature, there's a progression of this character from someone who is pretty unreflective and racist and unpleasant to someone who is forced to confront some very important things. Some of it is her own personal trauma. Some of it is her own racism. And this is a big part of the story. It's probably the most important part of the story, to be honest. The plot, the mystery element, it's good. But for me, it wasn't actually the strongest part of the book. To me, the thematic parts were actually what Adrian Gibson was trying to wrestle with in here. I think that it's a tricky situation to be in because, as far as I can tell, Adrian Gibson is himself a white male, and that puts him in, I think, an interesting position in respect to the themes that he's dealing with in here, and I think he actually pulls it off pretty well. Could it be a potentially tricky thing for sure. And I think it's important that authors like him do take these things on. So there is that. And then I think that the world building is also another element of this that I really love. I feel like this book is setting up a series, and one of the most interesting parts of it actually is the world building. This is a world that I feel that you can tell that Adrian Gibson has lived in and loves. And it's a gritty world. It's a very down and out world in many ways. But it is a world that he has fleshed out beautifully, and I think we're going to be seeing more development of this place. And so, yeah, I think the world building is quirky, it's different, it's gritty, and I think that is one of the most admirable aspects of the books of the book as well. And then, of course, the character development, and I think that that is handled pretty well. As I said, the relationship, particularly between Henrietta and Koji, I think that is also setting something up for the series. I hope very much so, anyway. In that sense, I do think this is a strong introduction, and I do, when I'm reviewing a book, I try to remember what the book is trying to do. I do not rate it on the basis of what I want it to be. I read it on the basis of how well it achieves what it's trying to do. And I think as a setup book for a series, it's really great. Not that you can't read it as a standalone, because you definitely can. This book has a very satisfying conclusion, case closed and all of that, for the most part. Though there are some threads, obviously, that will be continuing, some characters, some villain type characters who get away and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's a really solid and actually debut. I have to say too, it's well written. I appreciate the how clean it is, and how well written, how well Adrian Gibson captures the vibe of a crime noir type book, and giving it that twist that making the first person narrator a female. Um, Really great touches in here. I'm deeply impressed. So I do have to score it. My least favorite part of all the judging for SPFBO is putting on the score. But I do have to do that. So very briefly, my scoring system, I don't think I really need to address a 1 to 2, because if a book has gotten this far in SPFBO, it's not going to be a 1 or a 2. And 3 or 4 is a book that is pretty flawed, that really needs a lot of work, needs a lot of improvement in some aspect or other, that it's just a little bit raw. A 5 or a 6, I would call a really good book, a solid book, a book that I could recommend to many people. Whereas a 7 to 8 to me is a really excellent book. A 7 to 8 is something that has really impressed me, and I feel that it has handled something, whether it be the thematic aspects or the prose or the character work or whatever it might be, or a combination of these things, handled them really excellently. And a 9 to 10 for me is a brand new personal favorite, and obviously that's going to be pretty rare. A 9 to 10 is going to be a rarity here. A brand new personal favorite, and it just blew my socks off, and it's a book that I'll be raving about for months to come. So there you have it. That's my rating. And for me, Mushroom Blues is actually an excellent 8. 8 out of 10 is the score that I'm giving to Mushroom Blues, and it was a pleasure to read. And I do recommend, if you're in the mood for something different, a little bit gritty, and with some really a great attempt at dealing with some really important themes as well, then you definitely want to pick up Mushroom Blues. And that is it for me for now. Until next time.